You may proceed with your direct examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Before we get to neurocognitive deficits, before we leave the interviews that you did and the way that you did them, did you, over the course of your various interviews, go back into topics over again in order to try to drill down and get more information on various topics?
Yes.
And what's the reason for doing that?
It is important to go back on information that is provided over time to evaluate the consistency of the information that is reported, to go at it from different angles to assess if there are any changes or more information is provided, because many times as going through the interview there's so much to cover and observe the person that you cannot delve into all details, and at times it's unsuccessful because the person doesn't respond anymore. It's just that done. And you say, can you tell me more? Can you tell me more? I don't know what to say more. You let it rest and then you come back at it. So it's both for evaluating consistency and getting more information and maybe getting at it. It's like probing a little bit, pushing it a little bit more to get more information.
Is it your opinion whether that difficulty with communication, paucity of speech, is a symptom of the disease itself and something that you inherently have to deal with?
Yes, it's common.
Let's talk a little bit about videotaping. Did you videotape any of your examinations with Mr. Holmes?
I did not.
Do you have some kind of problem with videotaping or examinations, or is that okay with you?
It's okay, I have no problem.
Have you videotaped examinations before yourself in the past?
Yes, I did.
Do you do it in your clinical or your research work? Do you videotape examinations?
In the clinical setting, when somebody comes in or brought in with by family, we do not routinely videotape. It's a very sensitive time, and many times the last thing a patient would like to see is somebody putting with a camera. You have to establish, you have to convince them to get them to stay with us. In the research setting, it is different. So people who come for research are commonly clinically stable already. We get permission from the treating physician to approach them. So if there's any concern, patient care comes always first. So if there's any concern that participating in research will jeopardize the well-being, we do not approach them. When approached, we go through the process of informed consent that is approved by the university review board on an ongoing basis, and they sign the consent. Witnesses are there, and we ask their permission if they would like to be videotaped, because it can be helpful for training purposes, so that new people who are not familiar with schizophrenia can watch as part of the training. And also when we introduce new research procedures, new types of interviews, some of them we have developed in the research, were funded to develop, and we disseminate it, we make it available to the field at large. We ask the participating person to videotape the administration, and then we train people how to score it. So, for example, we developed a scale for negative symptoms, we videotaped people with their permission.
Okay. Is the benefit of videotaping that it creates a perfect record of what was said at the time? Is that a benefit, that it accurately records
yes.
the contents of the interview?
Yes.
is there potentially a danger sometimes in videotaping? Can it affect whether the person will talk or not?
It can. It's hard to predict at times, especially when somebody's first met and early in the course of illness and unmedicated. It's just harder to predict how they might react, and it might inhibit them. So you need to use some clinical judgment.
Now, have you recorded examinations you've done in any of the criminal cases that you've done?
Yes, I did.
And which of those did you record?
Mr. Billiard?
Okay, was that the case that you testified in?
Yes, in front of a judge.
And was that the competency for execution?
Execution,
case?
yes.
Now, how many times did you see Mr. Billiot in that case?
2 times.
Okay. Were both of those videotaped?
Both times were videotaped.
Okay. Did you have a problem with it being videotaped?
Not at all.
And did you in fact think it was fine that that was videotaped?
Yes.
So do you have any problem with Dr. Reed videotaping his examination?
Not at all.
Now, in that Billiot case, was it recorded? Were those recorded at your request, or was it something that they were just doing for all of the experts?
They were doing for all the experts.
If you'd had an objection of some kind, would you have said so?
Yes.
Okay. How about this case here? Did you were you told whether or not you could videotape this examination?
No.
Did you suggest that it should or should not be videotaped one way or the other?
I did not.
Was there really a discussion about whether to videotape it or not prior to your examinations?
There was not.
May I have one moment, Judge?
Yes.
At the time that you of the videotaped examinations of Mr. Billiot, was he in an extremely psychotic state, much like Mr. Holmes was in November 2012?
He was extremely psychotic, and he has been on death row, I think, for over 20 years.
Okay. Now, can we please have slide 3? I want to talk about neurocognitive deficits, if I might. Can you talk to us about this slide that you created about neurocognitive deficits in schizophrenia? What kind of domains are involved?
So, multiple behavioral domains that include both cognitive abilities and emotion processing. The cognitive can include abstraction, mental flexibility, attention, verbal memory is especially notable, spatial memory, memory for shapes, spatial abilities, and speed of performance and motor performance.
Now these sound a lot like some of the neuropsychological tests that Dr. Manguso and the domains in those tests that Dr. Manguso and Dr. Hanlon administered. Am I right about that?
Correct.
And you just mentioned speed. Is the speed, do some of those tests test not only the accuracy of the responses, but the speed to which they're given?
Yes.
Why is that significant?
There are 2 components to performance, thinking about it like the 2 horns to the bull. One is accuracy of performance, how accurate for each item is a response provided.
Getting the answer right?
The other is speed. So people can be very fast and wrong, just push on, respond wrongly. Or people can be deliberate and slow. In schizophrenia, as in other brain disorder, speed is especially important to be considered as well.
is the speed of cognition affected by schizophrenia, those parts of the brain, or how does that work?
The speed of cognition is affected because the processing of information is affected. And how you respond, the time is how fast you are able to get the information and respond to it. So speed is an important component in schizophrenia. The same way it is important in Alzheimer's. So it's not just schizophrenia, looking at schizophrenia as a brain disorder. It's important to look at speed.
And how do these potential deficits impact functioning and outcome then?
It varies. I mean, if you look at it varies. The degree of cognitive impairment is related to functioning. So people with schizophrenia who have lower cognitive abilities function on a daily basis. The ability to take care of themselves, the ability to hold a job, the ability to do everything that we do as healthy people, pay bills, things like that, is more affected. They need more supervision. They need somebody to guide them. And sometimes they need to live in a residential setting because they cannot function independently. So cognition is an important predictor of outcome.
Now, you've just talked about how some folks can't take care of themselves, need to be hospitalized, can't function normally. Now, we've heard testimony, and have you seen in the record that Mr. Holmes was able to do a lot of things in the spring of 2012 prior to this shooting. I mean, he continued to go to classes, he got some pretty good grades, he went to the gym, he rode his bicycle, he went to the store, he fed himself. I mean, he didn't need to be hospitalized. He seemed to be able to take care of those activities in daily life pretty well. How can that be?
Like in other disorders, brain disorders, there's a range of a level of impairment. Pre-morbid level of functioning, how was the person before the disease hit them, is very important. So people who are higher functioning across brain disorders, it's not unique to schizophrenia. The brain doesn't know schizophrenia from other disorders. We evaluate it, we diagnose it. So people with higher level of functioning have much more room to give before they deteriorate. So somebody with an IQ of 120, close to 130, superior in the population. Few people, small percentage, carry this IQ, but the time, you need help, you're talking about people with much lower cognitive abilities, 2-3 standard deviations below. So the fact that he was able, with his high level of functioning and with the psychosis emerging, to function is quite common. So, people that we see from student health at Penn who are psychotic, they were at Penn. They've great SAT. They live in the dorm. They're going to classes. It's a gradual process over time that takes place. And how early they're captured is important.
Have you treated clinically other high-functioning schizophrenics with high IQs who were professionals?
Yes. And
can you give us an example or two of that?
I can give you an example of a lawyer that we have treated. I did not mean it as a joke. I take every individual very seriously. So this lawyer graduated from an Ivy League school and was functioning and was at the head of a law firm. And he is the psychosis, when psychosis hits, is variable. I said commonly in age 15 to 25, but there are people who can be in the 30s. And he was married, and he had children, and he developed subtle signs in his late 20s. And he was able to compensate for it, taking more time preparing and taking notes. Within a year or what, his colleagues began to notice that he's not up to par, that he's not as sharp, that he's too delayed, that he makes it is not his usual self. It took years, the average, and for him to be able to function for that long period of time in a high-powered downtown office was incredible. So I've seen him. I've seen a graduate student in mathematics that took a while till he was diagnosed. So but there are few. The majority of people, the average IQ in the population is 100. So most people with schizophrenia, by the time they are diagnosed, they are below 100. So they might be 90, most people. So to have people who are high functioning, very few reports in the literature, because there are just few of them.
Is Mr. Holmes kind of at the end of that spectrum?
Yes, he is.
That's all right. Okay.
Ability to plan. Buy weapons and scout out the theater and assemble components of an incendiary device in your apartment. I mean, do you agree that Mr. Holmes was capable of doing those things?
He was.
Does that mean that he wasn't psychotic or wasn't under the influence of delusion?
No, within the delusional system that Mr. beliefs that Mr. Holmes was holding at that time, the mission that he was bound on accomplishing required step by step within a delusional system, he was able to do that.
And is that uncommon in schizophrenia?
As I said before, his level of intelligence, where he was in his disease and the pervasiveness of delusion, fortunately most people with schizophrenia are not like that. But you can see it in high-functioning delusional people. Yes.
Now, the end of this slide here says implicate frontotemporal brain systems. Is that just the part of the brain that we're talking about here?
Yes, so there are many studies that show that if you look at the deficit and you ask what part of the brain, what regions, what brain systems are most implicated, I say most, in schizophrenia, is the front of the brain that integrates and acts, and the temporal lobe that is related more to verbal memory and adjacent to it, to emotions, temporal limbic. Yes.
Okay, can I have slide 4, please? What does this slide represent, ma'am? And are these slides part of the research that you and the people that work for you have done at the University of Pennsylvania?
Yes.
And what does this slide reflect here? What are the letters along the bottom? ABF, ATT, what's that?
Okay, so ABF is abstraction, measures of abstraction and mental flexibility. Simply the ability to shift gears when we are stuck. Attention, the ability to focus on a task and ignore other stimuli that commonly come in the real world. Verbal memory is the ability to remember words, passages, sentences from material heard or read.
Okay, so are these the neurocognitive domains that were testified to by the neuropsychologists in their testing?
Correct.
So is this that you're giving those kind of neuropsychological tests, you and your staff there, to individuals who have schizophrenia and those who don't?
Correct.
Can you tell us how that works with the colors here?
Okay, so the turquoise are control men, 118 of them, and these are healthy men with no medical or psychiatric disorder who volunteer for the research and are evaluated for the health status. In red are women, also healthy women, 93 of them. In blue are men with schizophrenia, 88. And in pink are 51 women with schizophrenia. So all of them received the same battery individually by trained professionals. And the question that we addressed, and note this is from 1994, this was early in the field of looking in a systematic way at cognition in schizophrenia. On the left are z-scores. How many standard deviation one is from the mean? Below, minus, you're below the mean. 0 is the average performance of the healthy men, control men, and control women. And as you can see, is that people with schizophrenia, and these are people who have been ill for years, for several years. So these are people who have chronic schizophrenia. So people with schizophrenia have deficits across all cognitive functioning. There's not a single function that they are close to the healthy people. It goes from -1 to -3, which is huge difference. It's a very big, statistically, very significant. It's a significant deficit. And you see it across the board, but especially for attention and verbal memory, frontotemporal part of the brain. So this is very common and multiple times reported in the literature.
And so is this consistent in the research over all individuals with schizophrenia, generally speaking?
It's a group of people. It's a group of people. So it's an average of all the people, and there can be variability. Not every person with schizophrenia is like the other person. The same way that not every healthy person is like another person. That's why we try to study large samples, and this finding is prevalent in all of the psychiatric literature. It's not just a finding from the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay, can I have slide 5, please? What do we have here, Doctor?
Okay, this slide is just to show the level of analysis that is required in order to dissect the complexity. So what I've shown you are more chronic people. And the next question is, well, what about people who are first episode, FE in red? They come in for the first time diagnosed with schizophrenia. Do they have cognitive deficits already? That's the question. Or is it only chronic people who have deficit? Also, if you follow the people over time and they are now stabilized on treatment, does the cognitive deficit go away? And the answer is not. So if you look at the red, follow just the red, first episode, you can see that across the board, they are impaired relative to the 0 line, average of healthy people that are in blue and turquoise, and that the deficit persists, they fluctuate. It's not that everything is so consistent. It fluctuates. Some can get better and some remain worse. So the point that is important in this is the level of analysis that needs to be done, and showing that people with schizophrenia have significant impairment, can have significant impairment by the time of the psychotic presentation.
And can I have slide 6, please? Does this show how that can change when someone's medicated over time?
Correct. So at time 1, the people were not medicated. They just came in and they could participate without being medicated, and then they're medicated, time 2, in red. And what you can see, that they do get in some of the domains, they do get a little bit better. The star indicates statistically significance. It's beyond a chance. You know, everything changes, but it can be a chance that it changes. This means that if you repeat this again and again, it's a real finding. It is unlikely that it is obtained by chance. So the deficit can improve over time, but it's there. It's there. They do not get normal at the zero line cognitive functioning.
Okay, thank you. Slide 7, please. Does this talk about, slide reflect some of what you were telling us about people who have higher intelligence, higher education,
Yeah.
and how that can affect their functioning cognitively?
Yes, schizophrenia interrupts people just at the time when they're transitioning to adulthood and are moving toward independence in life. So many people never achieve the potential. What we did here, we looked at people who were accepted to college. So you know that they had the potential, they did the SATs, they did well, they went through an interview, they were in college when the disease hit them and they were affected by schizophrenia. This is the solid line, dark black. Next to them are people who were not college bound. The disease affected them either earlier or, during the end of high school, or not everybody goes to college. People find other vocations that are wonderful, but they were not college bound. And what we see is that if you look at the lower part, and you ask, these are the same cognitive domains: abstraction, attention, verbal memory, semantic memory for words, language, spatial ability, sensory and motor skills. You can see that the people who are in college perform across the board much better than people who were not college bound. All have schizophrenia. So education in schizophrenia is protective. It's a protective, and people with higher education have less cognitive deficits. In some domains, like abstraction, the half standard deviation is normal. It's within normal limits, they will be. So education matters. And on the symptoms, it matters as well. If we look at the left, these are the negative symptoms, measured with an established scale, and you see affective flattening on the left, alogia, avolition, lack of initiation, and anhedonia, lack of enjoyment. The people with high functioning people, higher education, have less pronounced negative symptoms except for anhedonia. And for the positive symptoms, they have less bizarre behavior, less thought disorder, and less hallucination. It suggests that looking at education, potential for education, brain capacity is important in looking at the cognitive and symptoms of people with schizophrenia.
Okay, thank you. We only have a couple more of these fascinating graphs here. Can I have 9, please? And we talked a little bit about flat affect and why that was important or significant in your opinion. Does flat affect matter?
Matters a lot.
How so?
So similar to address this question, because as I said before, affective processes, emotional processes, when well recognized that they are important in the clinical literature, were not part of systematic research. So why does it matter? So we divided a large sample of individuals with schizophrenia who were assessed for affect. They were assessed for other things as well. And we asked, what is the difference between people with flat affect, restricted affect, monotonous voice, lack of gestures, and people who are just like all of us, behave, move, express emotions. So the flat affect are in green. On the left is pre-morbid functioning. How did they do before they became schizophrenic? And we base this on interviews with parents, school records, teachers' comments, just the way that I described it before. And you can see that in childhood, there's no difference between the two groups on the left. Can I approach?
Your Honor, can she approach the diagram and point with the pointer?
Yes, but could you take the microphone with you? There's a microphone, a handheld mic. There should be yeah. If you could turn it on. There you go.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, thank you.
Go ahead.
So this is during childhood, the way they developed up to age 8. What the difference between the people with flat affect as far as functioning? No. But when you go to early adolescence, age 10 to 14, the people with flat affect do worse. They just perform overall, the way they navigate through childhood, in the social domain, things at home, parental observation, they're worse. When it comes to late adolescent, after age 18, 17, 18, you can see that the gap widens, and by adulthood, they're much worse. So this is for pre-morbid, before they develop schizophrenia. Flat affect is an ominous sign in schizophrenia. Quality of life in the clinical domain, overall, how do they do clinically? Social domain, friendships, the ability to be engaged with other children, with peers. Vocationally, the ability to part-time job as a student, and after that, done with school, to obtain jobs. Flat affect, means better. The blues, no flat affect, do much better clinically, socially, and vocationally. When they go for a job interview, it's easier to hire somebody who is expressive than somebody who is sitting frozen. As far as outcome, we follow the people for 2 years and ask the question, how do they do? So the people with flat affect, both clinically, both in relationship to peers, socially, and work, do worse. So flat affect is clinically important.
Thank you. Can I have slide 10 too? Does this basically reflect the same type of thing, ma'am?
The same type of things, but in relation to cognitive functioning, same type of domains. And you can see that the people with flat affect do worse here on verbal memory. And verbal memory is a very important component of schizophrenia. Very important. I tell people, if you have a chance to study one function, you don't have the time, look at verbal memory. And emotions, the ability to identify emotions in tests that relate to brain function, they do worse.
Thank you. Now, in your review of the neuropsychological testing, in particular, the neuropsychological testing that took place over time, is it clear that the neuropsychological testing reflected some cognitive deficits and change in Mr. Holmes over time?
Sustained.
Okay. What did the neuropsychological testing indicate to you, if anything, that was significant over time?
A decline, so a few things. One, highly intelligent level of function, highly intelligent intellectual abilities that are, the top percentiles. There are few people like that. So you're looking at the extreme of intellectual abilities. Within these level of intellectual abilities, there is variability. Important in evaluation.
I think she's still answering the question. The question was, what did the neuropsychological testing indicate to you, if anything, that was significant over time? So I think it's still part of her answer. So So, doctor, you may proceed. Just make sure you answer the question that has been asked, okay?
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
Variability and decline in verbal memory over time, over the about 2-year period. So longitudinal studies are very important in psychosis, and this is what the literature shows as well. I'm putting it not related to Mr. Holmes at all. Verbal ability takes a hit and declines in people, especially early in the first few years of the psychotic process.
Okay. What about the results with regard to Mr. Holmes? What was there a significant change there, or was there not?
Yeah, his verbal memory and intellectual abilities declined over from the early in the time when he was evaluated the first time to when he was evaluated in the second time.
Now, do you have an opinion about whether that's consistent with the diagnosis of a schizophrenia spectrum disorder?
It is consistent.
Does that in and of itself tell us that someone has schizophrenia or not?
No.
Is it an important factor to consider?
Yes.
Is that because, or not, we know that these neurocognitive deficits exist as a result of schizophrenia universally?
Yes.
Is there any way of corroborating that information in terms of looking at the actual brain? How can the brain structures themselves?
Yes.
And what is that?
There are two ways. One that is a previous way and is more limited is post-mortem studies where people who have suffered with schizophrenia die and the family donates the brain for research. Then you have direct observation, the way you do in other brain disorder, Alzheimer. The most common way, and especially for young people, is through neuroimaging that provides us with the tools of looking at the brain, at brain structure and function in a living person.
Okay. And was there any neuroimaging conducted in this case?
Yes, there was.
And what was that?
The more recent MRI imaging or the CAT scan you're referring to?
Let's start with the CAT scan.
So the CAT scan was done in the fall of 2012 following a change in mental status, acute exacerbation with psychotic features that were observed in jail and where Mr. Holmes jumped off the bed and hit his head. So commonly in such a situation, medically, an evaluation is warranted, and it was done, and it was before I ever saw him. And the CAT scan ruled out any structural lesion, namely there was no bleed in his brain as a consequence of falling off the bed.
And is that what, would that reflect in a clinical reading of a normal CAT scan, that there was no broken skull or
Yes.
damp bleeding in the brain?
Yes.
What else did the CAT scan reveal when you looked at it, when we were actually able to get our hands on the actual CAT scan?
So looking at the CAT scan with a neuroradiologist, we do all the studies that we do, a neuroradiologist reviews them in addition to the quantitative. This is the practice, the common practice. And the neuroradiologist, not familiar, not knowing anything about Mr. Holmes.
Sustain.
Did you, consultation with this person, influence and form the basis for an opinion that you formed?
Yes,
And what was that opinion?
that the ventricles, which is the body butterfly shaped in the middle of the brain, that has cerebrospinal fluid in which the brain is bathing, is slightly increased.
Now, so the brain is bathing? I don't understand that. What does that mean?
So, the brain is within the skull, which is a bony structure with protrusion and that needs protection. So, every time, otherwise, every time we sneeze or move, the brain is susceptible to damage. It's bathing in cerebrospinal fluid that is protective and is also for transfer of nutrients to the brain. So that's cerebrospinal fluid that the brain is sitting. In schizophrenia, there are increased the size of the vast literature that the size of the ventricle is increased.
What's a ventricle?
Ventricle is a body of butterfly-shaped in the middle of the brain that has in it the largest part of cerebrospinal fluid. So that's what I was looking for, to see if there's any indication. Commonly, it is not read in routine neurological reading. People will not pay attention to that because they look for a lesion, a bleed, a stroke, a tumor.
Okay. Was that significant in your opinion, what you saw in some ways?
Significant only to the point of saying, CAT scan is not the current standard for evaluating brain structure and function. Might be worthwhile to do an MRI. It is not diagnostic of schizophrenia, not on this basis.
Okay. And as a result, was there an MRI done?
There was an MRI done.
Do you recall when that was done? Or would it refresh your recollection to look at your report?
Mm-hmm.
Was that earlier this year?
Yes, and I can tell you the exact date. April 5th, 2015.
April 5th?
5th.
5th, 2015.
Correct.
May I have slide 14, please? What's this slide here?
That's a schematic illustration of an MRI setting that is available in most hospitals.
What
And
is an MRI as opposed to a
it's-
CAT scan?
So it's magnetic resonance imaging. It does not involve any radiation, and it relies on the administration of a pulse in the scanner that makes the hydrogen, the water in the scanner, shift, rotate, and then when the pulse stops, it falls, they stop, and you're able to obtain a picture of the brain. And these are the ventricles in the middle of the brain. Yeah.
Okay. And is this the type of procedure that was done with Mr. Holmes this year, recently?
Yes.
And may I have slide 15, please? What does this slide reflect? It looks like segmentation, it says up there. What does this reflect? Is this Mr. Holmes, first of all?
No.
Okay, what does this reflect then?
So this reflects the common presentation of how one slice of MRI brain looks like. And if you see that, in light
Judge, may she approach the diagram?
Yes, go ahead.
in light color here, these are the ventricles. This is where the fluid is, but also if you can see the light color, you can see it here in the salt side. So the brain is bathing in this fluid. You can also separate two gray matter in the brain, here shows in white, where the neurons are, the brain cells. So you get a quantitative measure of that, and to white matter in the brain that is more important for communication. The brain is gray matter, white brain cells, neurons, and white matter. So in addition to the neuroradiological reading of it, independently by machines nowadays, you can get the total brain volume and specifically look at brain structure. And it is done independent of the identity of a person.
I'm sorry, was there something else or? Okay. Is this a normal brain then, this picture here?
This is a normal brain.
Okay. May I have 16, please? And what does this reflect here?
This reflects the automated volumetric analysis
And what's a volumetric analysis?
It's looking at different volumes of brain structure in a well-validated, automated fashion. So there's no human involvement. It is done by machine learning, and it is the standard of research in the study of brain and behavior. And what you can see is that how you can color different brain regions and grooves with different colors. It's a labeled image. From this, you get that, and then you can ask for what is the volume of each small component in the brain. And that's how we compare people with schizophrenia to people who don't have schizophrenia. And this is just an example of how, in an original study, when the neuroradiologist was reading the eye resolution for looking for subtle differences is not perfect. It's very strong for looking at a brain tumor, at stroke, or marked atrophy, as you might see in people with advanced Alzheimer. Here, the original, this region in the temporal lobe looks normal. But when you do the quantitative analysis, there is 30% reduction in brain tissue here that is not observed by the naked eye, but is picked up by machine learning, by the segmentation process.
Thank you. You can take that down. And you can resume your seat if you would, ma'am. What did the volumetric analysis of Mr. Holmes' MRI show in your expert opinion?
So, his brain parameters, brain measures, were compared to 79 healthy people. So that you have a group of healthy people, the average, and you compare his measures to them to see what is the relationship between his measures and their measures, and it goes through statistical analysis, just the way that I've highlighted. And there were several significant differences that were noted in his brain compared to the normative sample of people who are free of any disease. One was that the right fronto-orbital part of the brain, important for many times emotion, decision making, but more emotional processing, is close to 3 standard deviation below that of healthy people. Again, on the right side of the brain has 2 hemispheres, the right and the left. The right side of the brain, the amygdala, which is deep inside below my ear, which is an important brain hub for emotion processing, is 2 standard deviation below healthy people. And the right medial frontal lobe, important for decision making, is 2 standard deviation below the mean. So there's evidence on the MRI that when compared in a rigorous way to healthy people, it shows decrease in brain volume, in brain structures that are pertinent to emotion processing and to decision making.
And was that, in your expert opinion, consistent with the deficits that were shown by the neuropsychological testing that was done over time?
Yes, and by the clinical observations as well.
And can you explain that just briefly, please?
Is that one of the most marked impairment that was evident just by observing was the restricted affect that relates to, and should be shown in schizophrenia, to relate to amygdala volume and to orbitofrontal. And the medial is related more to that his delusional beliefs, within the prominence of his delusional beliefs.
Okay. Again, is this, can you diagnose schizophrenia based upon an MRI?
No.
Is it significant when taken in consideration with all of the clinical findings, the symptomatic observations, your interviews, and the neuropsychological testing?
It's one element.
Do you have an opinion about whether it all fits together?
It fits together.
And what does it show?
May I ask a question? You mean what does fitting together show?
Yes.
It shows that there are brain systems implicated that are related to the important capacity to process emotion and make rational decision making.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk a little bit about the information that you received or reviewed concerning Mr. Holmes' family and his childhood. Is that all right?
Yes.
First of all, did you receive medical records that related to Mr. Holmes' grandfathers?
Yes.
Was that significant in your opinion based upon your review of those records?
Yes.
How was that psychiatrically significant?
One of the grandfathers had, in his 60s, presented with psychotic symptoms in the context of a medical disorder.
Was that his mother's?
Maternal, yeah, on his maternal side, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how about on his paternal side?
On the paternal side, one of his paternal grandfather had, while serving in the military forces, significant anxiety that related to the appearance of his nose, preoccupied, somatic preoccupation.
Okay. And were both of those individuals hospitalized for psychosis?
Yes.
One other thing. May I approach the exhibits, Your Honor?
Yes.
Can I please have DTR5 on the screen? This is an already admitted exhibit. No. DTR5. Apparently 25, but it looks like 5 to me. Do you see that on the screen, ma'am?
Yes, I do.
Is that something that you've had been able to review?
Yes.
And what is the significance of this in your opinion, if it is significant?
Well, it indicates this is for his aunt, his paternal aunt, that she, paternal aunt,
Okay.
that she has suffered from schizophrenia throughout her life, and affective features were prominent, and she got the diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder. So he does have an aunt with schizophrenia.
Okay. And does it indicate that how long she's had this disorder, or when it onset? She had her first breakdown.
Yes, she since 1980, since age 19, which is the typical age range that schizophrenia might present.
Talk a little bit about that. A typical age range of what?
So there's variability in when people with schizophrenia present. Late adolescence, early adulthood, the 20s is most common, but as I said before, people can present later than that, and this is the time that schizophrenia strikes. There are different approaches to try and explain it, why it does, but this is during a period of rapid brain changes, and also when we call upon our children to grow up and begin to assume more functioning. So this is a time of greater vulnerability this is when schizophrenia hits most commonly.
So
This is when she is.
grow up and go out on your own and make your own life as opposed to sitting at home playing video games, for example. Is that fair?
Yes?
And can I please have slide 18, ma'am? What is the significance of the fact that Mr. Holmes' family members have psychotic illnesses on both sides of his family, if that is significant?
So there's a very strong literature that shows genetic liability, sensitivity, vulnerability. Schizophrenia, like many other medical disorders, runs in families. It does not mean that if a person has schizophrenia, it means that there is a family member that must have schizophrenia. No. The majority of individuals with schizophrenia, it's sporadic. Didn't occur in other family member. However, when we get a history and we see that the family members, one, more, or afflicted with schizophrenia, the likelihood of another close relative being affected by schizophrenia is increasing. So from 1% in the population, it can become 5% or 10%. So this person is now more vulnerable. Not different than when we think about heart disease. So the irritability, the likelihood for genetic impact in schizophrenia is 80%. It's similar to diabetes. Doesn't mean that if you have a family member with diabetes, you will have it. No. But his family history is important. And he has a significant family history for psychosis, and we commonly obtain it in clinical practice when we see a new patient that when we consider schizophrenia in the diagnosis.
Thank you. You can take that down, ma'am. I want to talk to you a little bit about now Mr. Holmes' childhood and how that may be significant or not. And then we can move into graduate school a little bit later. But with regard to his childhood, did you say that you have had an opportunity to interview Mr. Holmes' parents?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Was it your desire to interview Mr. Holmes' parents from the very beginning of your involvement?
Yes, it was.
When were you finally able to do that?
I was able on, I believe, November 19th, 2014.
Okay.
I think so.
Do you want to check to verify that, or do you feel fairly confident about that?
I feel confident, but I always like to check. So,
Your Honor, may I retrieve that?
Thank you.
yeah, in November. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
November, I said 19th? Correct. November 19th, 2014, from 6:30 p.m. to 9:15 p.m. 2 hours and 45 minutes.
Okay. Were there any restrictions put on that interview?
No.
Did you ask them about Mr. Holmes' childhood?
I did.
From their perspective?
From their perspective.
Where did they live when Mr. Holmes was a child in elementary school, if you know?
In San Diego, California.
Okay. When did they move to San Diego? How old was he when they moved there?
When they moved, I'm not sure I follow.
Okay.
They moved from San Diego to Northern California.
Okay, when was that?
This was, I believe, in first grade, I believe, after he completed kindergarten, I think.
And
No,
then
he started Sundance School.
dance.
Yeah, he started
Is that the name of
Sundance
a school he
of
was
the
at?
school in San Diego, and then they moved up north.
Okay. What did they indicate? So, and where up north did they move?
So I have to remember the name, Centerville or
Castroville?
Castroville, yes.
Is that the artichoke capital of the world?
Yeah,
You know?
agricultural area, artichoke, yeah.
How did his parents describe his social abilities during his early developmental years, when he was a toddler and then when he was in elementary school, both in at the very first in San Diego and then during the years that they were in Castroville, up near Monterey?
As normal, he played with kids, he enjoyed the outdoors, he had friends in school and in the neighborhood. As expected, a typical boy, like to play ball, like to play soccer, active, no problems.
Okay. Now, we've heard some considerable testimony from a lot of witnesses that Mr. Holmes doesn't talk, that he doesn't interact socially, that he avoids eye contact, things like that in terms of his social interaction. Did his parents indicate to you that he has always been like that, that that's just the way he is? Or did they indicate to you that when he was a young child, that was different and it changed over time?
They indicated a change. There's variability among children. For those of you who are parents, not all of them talk at the same time or do everything at the same time. And commonly girls acquire language earlier than boys. So there was nothing in his behavior to cause them alarm. And then his father is a statistician, his mother is a nurse. So they were watching him, his development. There was nothing in his behavior overall at that time that caused them concern.
If someone has autism, for example, would that show up, that kind of social dysfunction earlier on when they're a child?
Autism presents early in life, commonly. It is evident within the second year of life, associated with a marked delay in language acquisition, echolalia, that can be repetitive movement, and inability to interact with others.
Okay. So is this change in his social interaction, tell us anything, or what is, does it rule out anything?
No, so the change occurred especially in his sixth grade, as toward the move, or associated, noted during the move back to San Diego.
Okay, they moved back to San Diego.
Back to San Diego.
At sixth grade.
Yeah, 2 weeks before the end of the year.
Okay, and tell us about how his parents related what happened during that period of time.
It was a difficult period of time for him, harder to accept, hard to separate from the friends that he has made and from the school where he did well. And they noted that during the going away party, he left early and did not stay till the end. And they thought that because it was difficult for him to say goodbye and move.
So is that that sounds pretty normal to me, that if a kid in sixth grade is moved from one place to another, that would be disturbing to them. Why can't we just attribute this change to situational factors, the move?
I think that you're correct. Move can be difficult for adults and for children, but there were other things that were noted at the time. For example, difficulty in talking on the phone to invite other children to interact. So Mrs. Holmes will practice with him on the phone a little bit, of like a dry run of how to talk when inviting other children, noted more increased in anxiety.
Okay. When you spoke with Mr. Holmes, did he indicate to you that what did he indicate to you about his early childhood years and any change that took place around that time, if anything?
The information that he provided was consistent with the one provided by his parents, that he liked living in Northern California, he did well in school, he had friends, he liked the outdoor, and that he didn't want to move. And the first indicated by him, not by his mother, that the first time that a thought of hurting himself has come up was, and he acted on it in a superficial way, was when they were driving in the car to San Diego, and he took a cardboard and used it on his wrist.
Okay. I mean, if a move like that can be upsetting to a child in 6th grade, is the fact that he had at least thoughts about suicide at that point, is that surprising?
It is.
Why?
Fortunately, most moves are not associated with that. He was distressed and depressed to the point that he didn't want to live. The thought that I'm better off dead occurred to him at that time, associated with the move. And to take this from this thought and feeling of, I don't want to go there, to actually cutting a piece of cardboard from a box that is sitting in the car on the seat next to him, cutting it off and applying it quietly to his hand and not talking about it to anybody, that's very unusual.
Is it strange that a child in 6th grade would even think about suicide?
It is. There are children that present early on, but it is uncommon to act upon it, to have thoughts about it can pop up, but to act upon it, even though superficial, and not to talk to anybody about it, is alarming.
Did Mr. Holmes tell you about whether or not during this period of time he started to feel differently about himself?
Yes.
And what could you describe that for us, please?
So he felt that more anxious, less comfortable around other students, playing more computer games, trying to keep more to himself, with increased level of anxiety among other people. And this is consistent with the description of his parents, that he seemed less happy, less enjoying things, and more anxious.
Did he did anything else change that he reported to you after that move to San Diego, other than he became more anxious? How did he describe that?
That some of the thoughts that will pop to his head of kill yourself, and they increased in frequency over time, and he will trying to block them get them out of his head, because they disturbed him, and they were what we will call intrusive. They were not welcome thoughts, sort of like a pop into my head, kill yourself.
So not welcome?
Yeah.
Can you explain how that can work? I mean, our thoughts are our thoughts, right? How can we have a thought that we don't think?
Yeah, but when a thought is experienced as a command, kill yourself, it's frightening to a person. And he was frightened by it and never disclosed it. It increased his level of anxiety and the effort to cope with it by distracting himself into activities, into becoming the best student he can be, into computer games with videos, and to block those thoughts out. And later on, by pulling his hair and the transfer of those thoughts to don't kill yourself, kill others, that went up with increase in frequency. So it was multiple component of withdrawal, spending, for example, even at home, he will read in a room, like block himself in a room, in a closet to read. Most kids don't sit and read in a closet when the household is a quiet household. But this is where he felt comfortable. Or when people will ring the bell, he will run away from the door, sort of fear of encountering strange people or people he didn't meet before. So we're talking about high level of anxiety in middle school, but he managed it. He was struggling with it, but managed it without disclosing it, but consistent with his mother's observations.
Now, were there writings in his notebook which were consistent with this, that indicated that he'd felt oddly about himself, that he had a broken brain way back into his childhood?
So we're talking now moving into adolescence, he recognized that something was wrong with him. And from his perspective, that is also disclosed in his writing, but also in the interviews, he needed to be biologically perfect. Having glasses before he moved to San Diego back was a sign of biological weakness. Having glasses is a sign of biological weakness.
Was that a significant thought in your opinion psychiatrically?
Yes.
Why? And explain that, please.
The wish for perfection, that you need to be a perfect person and excel in what you do and have no biological impairment. At such a young age, we're seeing glasses is not a nuisance. Now I might forget them, but I'm not a perfect specimen. It's very unusual to have this type of perception of something is wrong with me because I have glasses. When his anxiety was growing and the thoughts of suicidal thoughts were flashing through his head and marked anxiety in school, when seeing other kids and avoiding them or having to talk, this for him was another sign of biological weakness. Something is wrong with him. And as he grew older, he began to look of what is wrong with me and began to check on the internet what do the symptoms or what are the experiences that he's going through with increased frequency and intensity. What does it fit? What might I have? And without discussing it with anybody else.
Okay. Now, we've heard about social anxiety, and would you agree with me that a lot of people have social anxiety?
Yes, to some degree or another.
Okay. In the way that Mr. Holmes described it to you, though, beginning with being in high school, early in his high school years, what was the nature of the social anxiety that he felt when he was around other people? In other words, is that shyness or just awkwardness that's normal for a teenager, or to him did this have a more profound manifestation?
Well beyond the shyness or awkwardness that is common many times in adolescence. It is an intense, as he described it, and manifested in his body posture. This was the time when we were going that I described the first interview, when he was, shaking, was the description of himself when I asked him, what happens when you go through the hallways in school? What happens? He'd rather be buried in the wall. Kids who will walk next to him will be an ominous threat. Maybe they're looking at him. They know that they can tell that there's something wrong with him. It adds a psychotic flavor to it. Kids might feel awkward or sensitive, that's common. But the intensity of it and the anxiety and the plucking of his hair during this time and avoiding interaction is much higher than the social anxiety that a teenager or an adult, but at this time we're talking in his teenage years, can experience. It was extremely intense for him.
And did he describe that as so intense that he was paralyzed with fear?
Paralyzed when he was manifesting, I pushed him in this direction. Imagine that now you are in high school and you're walking down the halls. Tell me, how are you feeling right now? This is when he really didn't want to do it. And this is when his body language changed and he became red and had difficulty breathing. And I asked him, how do you feel now? Paralyzed. Almost what is described as fight or flight situation. Like he'd rather not, he can't be there anymore.
Did you notice in Dr. Reed's videotaped interviews that he repeatedly talked about freezing in social situations? Did he use similar language with you?
He did, consistent with Dr. Reed.
And what's the significance of freezing? Is that a phenomenon that's common in schizophrenia?
Not common in schizophrenia, except with very high levels of anxiety before somebody is treated. And freezing is associated with amygdala dysfunction. And that's why in the MRI I attributed significance that it goes with that, with the volume of the amygdala. That's the mechanism that we have in our brain that is shared by lower animals of fight or flight. You know, the situation of freezing, where you are threatened, you feel under threat, and you have to fight or remove yourself from the situation. So it's high level of anxiety, very high level of anxiety.
Does any of the research that you've done talk about how the brain reacts in these individuals under those circumstances?
Correct.
Can you describe that briefly, please?
So when we present, MRI gives an opportunity to look at functional MRI. You can present, when people are in the scanner, you can present to them stimuli, pictures on a computer screen, the way we are doing now, and what you show them is specifically designed to activate a specific brain system. So because flat affect, prominent in schizophrenia, is associated with impaired emotional functioning, many studies, not just ours, have presented people with schizophrenia in the scanner with pictures of people. We use professional actors and actresses showing emotions. So it can be a happy emotion, it can be anger. I'm not maybe as good at it. The actors and actresses are really good at it. Fear. And we ask them to identify the emotion by pushing a button, and we watch what happens in the brain. For people with schizophrenia, the amygdala response is very different than healthy people, especially for faces that are threatening, faces expressing fear and faces expressing anger. The healthy people show increased amygdala activation. It's the alarm system in the brain. People with schizophrenia are flat, like the amygdala is frozen, cannot react, they freeze.
Now, when I looked at the videotape with Dr. Reed and he talked about freezing, I didn't see him go like this and almost like start crying and get all red in the face. It looked to me like he was just sitting there the same way he was the whole rest of the 23 hours. How can you explain the difference in when he talked about it to you?
I think there are multiple factors. I think I'm the first who spoke to him about that. I pushed him hard and repeatedly to explore more what is it like to be in school, putting him in the school setting. I think that by the time I did it, he felt more comfortable, although he said that he was afraid of me, of what I might do to him. He has gone through that repeatedly over the course of 2 years, and the effect of medication takes time, and he was stabilized on medication and improved. So with this, he looked somewhat different, and it's not that, he looked like that more, and it's in my note, as I see him every time I saw him. He felt more comfortable, and he spoke more freely. This was the exception, and it was telling because it demonstrated to me visually in front of me of what was it like for him during years of to go through experiencing day by day when going to school the fear around people.
Mr. King, I'm sorry, it's 12, so it's time to take our lunch break. Members of the jury, let's go ahead and take our lunch break at this time. Please make sure that you comply with all my admonitions during the break. Let's plan to have you back here at 1:30, okay? Thank you. Please be seated, everyone. The record should reflect that the jury has exited the courtroom. Doctor, you can go on break. There are a few things I need to talk to the attorneys about, but you can go on break, okay?
Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, I have a few housekeeping matters to go over. The first thing is just planning ahead. I am intending to have all the exhibits submitted to the jurors during their deliberations, and we would have to select the largest jury room, which would be the one here for Division 201, but I think we can get all of the exhibits in there. I just wanted to let the parties know I'm treating it the way I would treat any other case. The only thing that we would not send back to the room would be the ammunition, because we would be sending the weapons, and I would give them an instruction that if they wanted to see the ammunition, they would have to ask for it, and we'd take back the weapons, any firearms, and then give the ammunition to them. But they can't have both. That's just a policy that we have for obvious reasons.
And I assume what Your Honor is saying is the live ammunition, the spent rounds and the casings are okay to go back?
Correct. I'm talking about the live ammunition, right? And then, but CDs, DVDs, that kind of thing, they all would go back, but they wouldn't have a way to play any of them. And obviously, if they at some point wanted to play them, then they would have to ask us for some equipment. And then I would obviously call you in at that time, although it may be preferable to talk to you ahead of time. But we need to plan ahead, and so I'm telling you that this is how I'm intending to proceed. If anybody has an objection or sees a problem with that, now is the time to tell me. Ms. Nelson.
Just on that note, Your Honor, I just wanted to let you know that we've been going through and having our support staff go through and check our list of admitted exhibits against the court's list, just to make sure that we're clear and that there aren't any discrepancies. And I think there are a couple, and they certainly could be on our end. I haven't had a chance to go through that yet, but I just wanted to let you know that we're doing that, and if there are some discrepancies that we see, we'll make an effort to try to clear those up, just to make sure that we're all clear on what's been admitted and what hasn't.
Please. I would like you to do that. My staff has been particularly careful with exhibits, and that's not my request, but I would appreciate it if you have a discrepancy to let us know, let my staff know so that we can address it on the record. There are a lot of exhibits, obviously, and it may be difficult for them to navigate through them, but I'm not intending to give them any kind of table or index or anything like that, because it gets problematic. And the reason for that is that the only way that would be helpful is if each item has a description. And I don't think it's appropriate for them to have a description, whether it's from the court or the parties. They'll just have to find their way through them, and hopefully they'll put them back in the right place because we have them organized in boxes. But and we'll ask them to do that. But they cannot have an index or a table of contents or anything like that for the reasons that I just stated. The next item on my list has to do with the exhibit that was admitted earlier today. That's D-TR-94. And I informed Mr. Brockler and Mr. King that I would make a more detailed record about that later, and so let me do that now. Neither side provided any authority, and so I did some research on this, and this has to do with the defendant's writings at the jail. I found some case law, nothing from Colorado. There's nothing, there's no authority in Colorado on this point, but I did find some authority in other states. I found the case of Toth versus State. That's T-O-T-H. That's a very recent Wyoming Supreme Court case. In fact, from last month, from just a couple of weeks ago, June 17, 2015. And although it was in a different context, it has a discussion that I think is pertinent to this issue here. The context in that case had to do with the defense attempting to elicit the content of the defendant's incoherent babblings to further support his self-induced intoxication defense. In that case, I think the assertion was that he was under the influence of methamphetamine, and as a result, he was confused and was having hallucinations, both visual and auditory. And here's a discussion from the Wyoming Supreme Court. Nonsensical statements and those that are patently untrue in light of observable conditions have historically been received to prove insanity, competency, testamentary capacity, and other issues relating to mental state. And they cite People versus Vanda, V-A-N-D-A, which is published at 444 Northeastern 2nd 609. That's a case from the Illinois Court of Appeals from 1982. In that case, the defendant's letters from jail indicated that he was helping to run the jail or that he was a prison fireman. And the court found that they were admissible to show insanity. If I remember correctly, and I found that case independent of this case, by the way. And if I remember correctly, the appellate court reversed the trial court's ruling on hearsay grounds and said this is not hearsay and should have been admitted. Another case that's cited in the Wyoming, or by the Wyoming Supreme Court case, is People versus Garlick, G-A-R-L-I-C-K, which is published at 360 Northeastern 2nd 1121. That's a case from the Illinois Court of Appeals from 1977. In that case, the defendant's out-of-court statements were found to be admissible as non-hearsay evidence of mental state. People versus Chancey, C-H-A-N-C-Y, another case from Illinois, published at 414 Northeastern 2nd, 1239. That's a case from the Illinois Court of Appeals from 1980. The words fantastic, super dopey, D-O-P-E-E, and me, which were written on a blackboard at the scene of the crime, were found to be non-hearsay. Sollers versus State, S-O-L-L-A-R-S, that's a case from the Nevada Supreme Court from 1957, published at 316 Pacific 2nd, 917. The defendant's classic paranoid letters were admissible as non-hearsay evidence of mental state. Chase versus State, that's a case from the Alaska Supreme Court from 1962, published at 369 Pacific 2nd, 997. overruled on other grounds by Shade versus State, SCHADE, 512 Pacific 2nd 907, Alaska, 1973. In that case, the defendant's out-of-court statements were admissible on the issue of insanity. And then, independent of the Wyoming Supreme Court's opinion, I found Price versus State, which is a case from the Texas Court of Appeals, 627 Southwestern 2nd, 253. That's a case from 1982. Similar ruling. By the way, in the Toth decision, T-O-T-H, the court said here, the non-statements, and the court referred to them as non-statements because they were nonsensical statements, by virtue of being non-statements, were not assertions. Furthermore, by the very fact that they were non-statements, we cannot conceive how the officer's testimony could have been used to prove the truth of the matter asserted. That was referring to the responding officer. In the Wyoming case, it was not, it did not involve statements made at the jail after arrest. It involved statements made around the time of arrest to the responding officer. The court, and I just quoted part of the opinion, the court went on to say that nonsensical statements and those that are patently untrue in light of observable conditions have historically been received to prove insanity, competency, testamentary capacity, and other issues relating to mental state. That's what I mentioned at the very beginning of my discussion of that case. The court then added, nonsensical or delusional statements may be as clear an indication that the utterer, U-T-T-E-R-E-R, is not in his right mind as physical signs and symptoms or bizarre behavior, and they can thus be verbal acts or words of independent legal significance which are not hearsay. And then there's a cite to McCormick and evidence in Mueller and Kirkpatrick on federal evidence. So for all those reasons, I find that Exhibit D-TR-94 is admissible. For the same reasons, the statement by the defendant at the jail related to doing something with a light bulb, and I think he was trying to put out some kind of hairspray bottle and doing something with it, and then was asked what he was doing and made a statement about it, and then the statement related to an electrical outlet are admissible based on this authority as well. I admitted them last week, or I found last week that they were admissible under a hearsay exception, but this authority would seem to indicate that they're not hearsay and they're admissible as not hearsay. And I said last week that even though I had initially rejected them, that I would allow the defense to introduce them into evidence, and that's still my ruling. I'm just saying that this authority would indicate that they are admissible for a different reason. And if the defense needs the court's assistance in getting that witness back here or getting a different witness here to testify about them, the defense should let me know, because the court will provide that assistance. The other reason that D-TR-94, or the other basis that it's admissible under, is Rule 703. And I mentioned that at the bench conference, but I did not make a complete record. Under Rule 703, the facts or data in the particular case upon which an expert bases an opinion or inference may be those perceived by or made known to the expert at or before the hearing. If of a type reasonably relied upon by experts in the particular field informing opinions or inferences upon the subject, the facts or data need not be admissible in evidence in order for the opinion or inference to be admitted. And what I found during our bench conference is that although Mr. King did not ask Dr. Gurr whether D-TR-94 is of a type reasonably relied upon by experts in a particular field informing opinions or inferences upon the subject, that the record convinces me that the writings are of a type reasonably relied upon by experts in the particular field informing opinions or inferences on the subject of the defendant's sanity. And I made that ruling based on the experts who have testified before Dr. Gurr, and I think as I recall, these writings were submitted to Dr. Reed, and I can't remember now if Dr. Woodcock reviewed them or not, but Dr. Metzner, I believe, reviewed them. Dr. Reed, I know for a fact, questioned the defendant about them. So I do think that these are the type that an expert would be justified to rely on informing an opinion on the issue of sanity, and that would be an expert in the field of psychiatry. So, but because I'm admitting them, oh, and further, there's one more finding I have to make under Rule 703, and that is that the probative value in assisting the jury to evaluate the expert's opinion substantially outweighs any prejudicial effect, and I make that finding here. I find that the probative value of the writings in assisting the jury to evaluate Dr. Gur's opinion substantially outweighs the any prejudicial effect. Now, generally, I might entertain a request for a limiting instruction for evidence admitted under Rule 703, but in this case, because I'm also admitting D-TR-94 as non-hearsay, I'm not going to give that instruction. I am admitting it not only under Rule 703, but also independent of Rule 703 based on Toth, TOTH versus State, and all the other authority that I cited a moment ago. And when I came across this authority, it led me to think again about the videotaped interview that was done by a defense investigator of the defendant while he was in the hospital. And I continue to see that as different, because in that case, the defendant, as I recall from watching the video recording, is in a hospital bed, and he seems groggy. It seems like he may be under the influence of substances, and there's a discussion that's going on, and at least some of the statements that he's making are statements that are not nonsensical, are statements that frankly make a lot of sense. Talking about, for example, the Broncos having beaten the Chargers the day before, I believe it was, and I think he's asking whether it was offense, defense, or special teams that did the Chargers in, and the answer is all three phases, basically. And then I think Mr. Holmes asked about the cheerleaders, and so there are at least portions of it that are not that make a lot of sense and are just normal conversation and are not nonsensical. And so in its entirety, I continue to find that the videotape is not admissible even under this authority that I found yesterday. The last thing that I wanted to make a record on was with respect to the discussion we had yesterday. I went back and looked at Order D-264 small a-3, and specifically footnote 4. And what I said in that order, which by the way dealt with the defense's request to have me order the videotape examination of the defendant by Dr. Reed redacted, which I granted in part. In footnote 4, I said, of course, like Dr. Reed, other experts will have an opportunity to testify about questions they asked or topics they discussed during their examination of the defendant, even if those questions did not bear fruit. And I went back and looked at that order in the context of discussing the early environmental insult, which was a discussion we had yesterday in the context of one of the slides that the defense wanted to use with Dr. Gur, because Mr. King argued that the court had allowed some of the videotape questions by Dr. Reed of the defendant, even though they eventually were not significant to his conclusions or findings or opinions. Not only the questions, but the answers in response to those questions. And I said in my order that I was allowing some of those questions for the purposes of showing the thoroughness and reliability of Dr. Reed's examination. And I thought that it was relevant for those reasons. Here, the issue isn't what Dr. Gur asked the defendant during one of her meetings with him. The issue had to do with Dr. Gur looking at some records on her own and the defense wanting to have her testify about those medical records. And I just want to make clear, I don't have a problem with the defense asking Dr. Gurr if she reviewed medical records that go back to the defendant's birth. I don't have an issue with that. I think that goes to the thoroughness and reliability of her findings and conclusions. But what I have an issue with is having any testimony related to the fact that apparently when Mr. Holmes was born, his mother had gestational diabetes, and that also he was lodged in the pelvis during the birth process, which caused him to have a flattened head, and was then had to be born by C-section as a result. Mr. King admitted yesterday during his comments that Dr. Gurr's opinion is that this was not a cause of schizophrenia in this case, and that in fact this is not contained in her opinions, and for that reason was not even disclosed to the prosecution because it doesn't form the basis for any of her opinions. And so I don't have a problem with her saying she went back and discussed records as far back as when the defendant was actually born, and having to do with the birth of the defendant, just to show how thorough she was. But to have her then go into the contents of those records only to say to the jury, oh, and by the way, the contents of those records do not have any significance for any of my opinions and do not form the basis of my opinions, that's the part that I think it is improper. So long as the contents of the records are not significant to her and do not bear on the basis for her opinions, then that information is irrelevant. To the extent that that information had any significance for her or affected her opinions in any way, then it should have been disclosed, and it was not. And so either way, it would be improper. But in this case, I think Mr. King was very candid with the court yesterday. Although initially he had, I think, stated it wrong, he came back to it and said, I didn't say it right. In this case, this had no effect on her, and it did not affect her opinions, and it did not form the basis for any of her findings or opinions. So just wanted to clarify that. I think that's all I have. Is there anything that the parties need to talk about at this time on behalf of the people? Mr. Orman?
Sort of lost track, Judge. What time do you want us back from the?
1:30, please. Is there anything from the defense? Mr. King?
I've marked Dr. Gurr's slides as CTR 83, if I could submit those to the court.
Yes, those are in their entirety, correct?
Yes.
All right, great. Okay, thank you. The court will be in recess. Thanks, everyone.